The morning mist hung low over the grounds of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III adjusted his military uniform for what he believed would be a routine inspection of the royal guard. At 75, his hands moved with practiced precision, fastening each button and medal with the same care his mother had taught him decades ago. The weight of the crown might have been symbolic on this particular day, but the weight of responsibility never left his shoulders. Charles had been king for just over 2 years now, yet some mornings he still expected to wake up as the Prince of Wales, waiting for a call that would never come again. The transition from heir to sovereign had been swift, almost brutal in its finality. One moment, he was the longest-serving heir apparent in British history, and the next, he was the defender of the faith, the head of the Commonwealth, the embodiment of 1,000 years of monarchy. His valet, Thompson, had served the royal family for 37 years. He had dressed 3 generations of royals, each with their own quirks and preferences. Charles preferred his uniforms pressed to military precision, every crease sharp enough to cut glass. It was a habit formed during his own service in the Royal Navy, where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. "Your Majesty," Thompson said softly, adjusting the ceremonial sword at Charles's side. "The guard is assembled in the courtyard. Colonel Morrison reports they've been ready since dawn." Charles nodded, catching his reflection in the ornate mirror that had witnessed countless royal preparations. His father's eyes stared back at him, though Philip had been gone for several years now. Sometimes Charles wondered if he was living up to the example set by both his parents, or if he was merely playing a role that had been written for him long before his birth. The inspection of the royal guard was more than ceremony. It was a sacred trust between the monarch and those sworn to protect him. These were not just soldiers in elaborate uniforms performing for tourists. They were elite troops, many of whom had served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflicts where the Union Jack flew in dangerous places. Their red tunics and bearskin hats might look ceremonial to visitors, but beneath the pageantry lay the steel of professional warriors. As Charles made his way through the palace corridors, each step echoed with the weight of tradition. Portraits of his ancestors watched from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress. Here was Henry VIII, whose break with Rome had forever changed the role of the English monarch. There was Victoria, who had given her name to an era and ruled over an empire where the sun never set. His own mother's portrait, painted just 5 years before her death, showed her in the same uniform he now wore, her eyes bright with the same sense of duty that now drove him. The palace staff he passed offered respectful nods and courtesies. Mrs. Patterson, who had managed the royal kitchens for 20 years, paused in her morning briefing with the sous chefs to acknowledge her sovereign. James, the young footman who had started just 6 months ago, tried to hide his nervousness as the king passed. Charles made a mental note to speak with the boy later. He remembered his own early days learning royal protocol, when every interaction felt like a potential disaster waiting to happen. Reaching the grand entrance hall, Charles could hear the muffled sounds of the guard's preparation through the massive oak doors. The rhythmic stamp of boots, the quiet commands of officers ensuring every detail met the exacting standards of the household division. He had witnessed this same ritual thousands of times as Prince of Wales, but now the ceremony took on a different meaning. These men and women were not just honoring tradition. They were pledging their lives to his service. His private secretary, Sir Richard Pemberton, appeared at his elbow with a day's schedule. "Your Majesty, after the inspection, you have the meeting with the Prime Minister at 11, followed by the Commonwealth representatives at 1:30. The children from the local school are expected at 3 for the garden party." Charles barely heard the words. His mind was focused on the moment ahead, the brief ceremony that would connect him to every monarch who had stood in this same spot, wearing similar uniforms, accepting similar pledges of loyalty. The weight of history pressed down upon him, but it was a familiar burden now, one he had been trained to carry since childhood. The massive doors swung open, and the morning light flooded in, illuminating the red and gold of the assembled guard. 60 men and women stood in perfect formation, their faces hidden beneath the shadow of their bearskin hats, their rifles held at identical angles. The sight never failed to stir something deep in Charles's chest, a mixture of pride and humility that came from representing something larger than himself. Colonel Morrison, a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, stood at attention before his troops. His uniform bore the ribbons of a dozen campaigns, but Today he was simply a guardian of tradition, a keeper of oaths that stretched back centuries. Behind his professional demeanor, Charles knew, lay the same nervous energy that affected everyone in the presence of their sovereign. Not nervous fear, but the heightened awareness that came from participating in something sacred. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the distant sounds of London waking up. Beyond the palace gates, the city went about its daily business, most people unaware of the ceremony taking place behind the high walls and iron railings. But for those present in the courtyard, this moment existed outside of ordinary time, connected to every similar ceremony that had taken place on these same stones. Charles stepped forward, his polished boots clicking against the ancient cobblestones. Each step brought him closer to a moment he had anticipated with the same mixture of pride and responsibility he felt before every royal duty. The guard would present arms, he would inspect their ranks, and the eternal bond between monarch and military would be renewed once more. The silence in the courtyard was absolute except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional cry of a seagull overhead. Even the palace staff who had gathered to witness the ceremony seemed to hold their breath, recognizing the solemnity of the moment. This was not theater, though it might appear so to outsiders. This was the living embodiment of a constitutional monarchy, where ceremony and substance intertwined to create meaning larger than its individual parts. As Charles approached the front rank of the guard, he could see their eyes fixed straight ahead, their faces set in the expressionless mask required by military discipline. Yet behind that discipline, he knew, lay individual stories of service and sacrifice. Some of these soldiers had saved lives under fire. Others had stood guard over their fallen comrades in distant deserts. All of them had chosen to serve something greater than themselves, just as he had been called to serve by birth and circumstance. The moment of salute was approaching, that instant when 60 rifles would move in perfect synchronization, when 60 voices would cry out their allegiance to crown and country. Charles straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of his uniform, the presence of his ancestors, and the expectations of a nation. He had performed this inspection hundreds of times, but somehow this morning felt different, charged with insignificance he couldn't quite identify. Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and clear and filled with the authority of command. The guard tensed imperceptibly, every muscle ready to execute the movements they had practiced thousands of times until they became as natural as breathing. Charles stood ready to receive their tribute, unaware that in the next few moments, everything he thought he knew about duty, service, and the bonds between ruler and ruled would be forever changed. The command echoed across the courtyard with military precision. Royal Guard. Present arms. Colonel Morrison's voice carried the authority of decades of service, each word crisp and unmistakable in the morning air. Charles stood at attention, his eyes forward, waiting for the familiar sound of 60 rifles moving as one, the metallic symphony that had accompanied such ceremonies for generations. But the sound that reached his ears was not what he expected. Instead of the sharp crack of rifles being brought to the ceremonial position, there was a different noise entirely. The soft whisper of movement, yes, but not the movement of weapons. Charles's eyes, trained by years of military protocol never to waver during such moments, remained fixed ahead, but his hearing detected something unprecedented. The rustling of fabric, the gentle sound of metal against leather, and then something that made his breath catch in his throat. The sound of kneeling, one by one, starting from the front rank and spreading like a wave through the formation, the members of the Royal Guard were dropping to one knee. Not in the sharp, disciplined movement of a planned ceremony, but in something that seemed to come from a deeper place, a spontaneous expression that bypassed military training and spoke directly from the heart. Charles's composure, maintained through decades of public appearances, nearly cracked. His eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of his inner turmoil. This was not protocol. This was not in any manual or tradition he knew. For a moment, panic flickered through his mind. Had something happened? Was this some form of protest? Had he somehow failed them? But then he saw their faces. Guardsman Williams, 23 years old from a small town in Wales, was the first Charles's gaze fell upon. Tears were streaming down the young man's cheeks, his usually stoic expression replaced by something raw and vulnerable. His rifle lay carefully placed on the ground beside him, abandoned not in disrespect but in favor of something more important. His hands were clasped before him, not in prayer exactly, but in a gesture of profound respect that seemed to come from his very soul. Behind Williams, Corporal Singh, a Sikh soldier whose grandfather had served in World War II, knelt with his head bowed. The tears that fell from his eyes caught the morning light as they dropped to the ancient stones beneath his knees. His usually immaculate turban remained perfect, but his shoulders shook with emotion that years of military discipline couldn't contain. The wave of kneeling continued through the ranks. Sergeant MacDonald, a tough Glasgow woman who had served 3 tours in hostile territories without flinching, was on her knees with tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear or weakness, but from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. Charles felt his own eyes beginning to burn. This was not the crisp salute he had anticipated. This was something far more powerful, far more personal. As his gaze swept across the kneeling figures, he began to understand what was happening. This was not about military protocol or royal ceremony. This was about human connection, about the bonds that exist between people who serve the same ideals, who carry the same burdens. Lance Corporal Jackson, whose father had served in the Falklands War, knelt with his head bowed, so low it almost touched the ground. His massive frame, usually so intimidating in his red tunic and bearskin hat, seemed somehow smaller, more vulnerable. The medals on his chest caught the light as his breathing hitched with suppressed sobs. The sight that perhaps moved Charles most was Guardsman Patel, barely 19 years old, whose mother had died just 2 weeks earlier. The young soldier had requested leave for the funeral, but had been denied due to the importance of today's ceremony. Now he knelt with his face upturned toward his king, tears streaming down his smooth cheeks, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply the repetition of his oath of service. Colonel Morrison himself, the veteran officer who had commanded the ceremony, stood frozen for a moment, his own disciplined facade cracking as he watched his soldiers express something that went beyond military training. His hand moved instinctively toward his sword, not in threat, but as if seeking comfort from a familiar weight. Then, slowly, deliberately, the colonel removed his hat and placed it carefully on the ground beside him before dropping to one knee himself. The emotion in Morrison's face was perhaps the most profound of all. Here was a man who had seen combat, who had made life and death decisions under fire, who had held dying soldiers in his arms on foreign battlefields. Yet as he knelt before his sovereign, his face showed a vulnerability that spoke of something deeper than military duty. His lips moved silently, and Charles realized the man was speaking the oath of allegiance, not because it was required, but because in this moment it felt necessary. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sounds of London seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Charles stood alone among the kneeling figures, no longer just their king, but somehow their brother, their comrade in service to something larger than any of them individually. His own training told him to maintain composure, to accept this unprecedented honor with the same dignity he brought to all royal duties. But Charles was discovering that there were moments when training failed, when the human heart demanded expression regardless of protocol or propriety. His throat tightened, and he felt the hot sting of tears threatening to spill from his eyes. Guardsman Thompson, no relation to the royal valet, but sharing the same surname, knelt in the second rank with his head bowed so deeply that his bearskin hat had fallen to the ground beside him. His red hair caught the morning light, and Charles could see that his shoulders were shaking with barely controlled emotion. The young man's hands were pressed together so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Private Davies, whose brother had been killed in action 2 years earlier, knelt with her face raised toward the sky, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Her usually perfect posture had given way to something more honest, more human. The pain of loss and the pride of service warred in her expression, creating something beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. As Charles looked upon each face, each individual story of service and sacrifice, he began to understand what was truly happening. This was not just a spontaneous break from protocol. This was a moment of recognition, of shared humanity between sovereign and subject, between commander and commanded. These soldiers were not just acknowledging his rank or title. They were honoring the man who carried the same burdens they did, who served the same ideals, who understood the weight of duty that sometimes threatened to crush the soul. The morning breeze stirred through the courtyard, rustling the fallen leaves and carrying with it the scent of autumn and change. But the kneeling figures remained motionless, locked in their spontaneous expression of respect and solidarity. Some wept openly, others maintained their silence, but all shared the same profound sense of connection to their sovereign and to each other. Charles realized that his hands were trembling slightly, the only outward sign of the emotional storm raging within him. This was not the ceremony he had prepared for, not the routine inspection he had anticipated. This was something entirely new, something that would change his understanding of leadership, of service, and of the bonds that connected him to those who had sworn to protect him. The weight of the crown had never felt lighter, and yet more significant than it did in this moment of unexpected grace. The silence stretched on, heavy with emotion and meaning that transcended any ceremony Charles had ever witnessed. As he stood among the kneeling soldiers, their tears glistening in the morning light, he felt something fundamental shift within himself. The careful barriers he had constructed over decades of royal duty, the protective distance he maintained between himself and those he served, began to crumble like ancient walls finally succumbing to time. His first instinct was to follow protocol, to acknowledge their gesture with a formal response, and continue with the planned ceremony. But as he looked into their faces, really looked perhaps for the first time, he saw something that protocol could never address. These were not subjects performing duty. These were fellow human beings sharing their most vulnerable selves with him. Guardsman Williams, still on his knees in the front rank, raised his eyes to meet Charles's gaze directly. The young man's face was streaked with tears, but his expression held no embarrassment, no attempt to hide his emotion. Instead, there was a raw honesty that cut straight through decades of royal formality. His lips moved silently, and Charles realized he was mouthing the words, "Thank you, Your Majesty." But what was he thanking him for? Charles hadn't done anything extraordinary. He had simply shown up for a routine inspection, wearing his uniform, carrying out his duties as he had been trained to do since childhood. Yet somehow, in this moment, that simple act of presence seemed to mean everything to these soldiers. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They weren't thanking him for being their king. They were thanking him for being there, for sharing their burden, for understanding the weight of service in a way that perhaps only another servant could truly comprehend. In their eyes, he wasn't the distant figure from the balcony or the signature on official documents. He was a fellow traveler on the difficult path of duty. Charles felt his own carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. His throat tightened, and despite years of training in emotional control, he felt tears beginning to burn behind his eyes. This was dangerous territory for a monarch. Kings weren't supposed to cry, weren't supposed to show vulnerability, weren't supposed to be human in the eyes of their subjects. But as he stood there, surrounded by the emotional honesty of these soldiers, Charles realized that perhaps being human was exactly what was needed. Perhaps the distance he had maintained, the formality he had preserved, was not protection but prison for himself and for those who served him. Sergeant MacDonald, the tough Scottish woman whose reputation for discipline was legendary throughout the Guards, looked up at him from her kneeling position. Her weathered face, scarred by years of service and hardened by experiences that would break lesser souls, was soft with an emotion Charles had never seen before. Her eyes, usually sharp and alert for any breach of protocol, now held something approaching love. Not romantic love, but the deep affection shared by those who understood each other's struggles. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying across the silent courtyard with perfect clarity. "We see you." Those three simple words shattered the last of Charles's defenses. Throughout his entire life, he had been seen as a symbol, a representative, a figurehead. People saw the crown, the title, the position. They saw the heir apparent, the future king, the sovereign. But no one had ever simply seen him. The man who carried the weight of expectation, who struggled with doubt, who sometimes lay awake at night, wondering if he was worthy of the trust placed in him. The tears he had been fighting finally escaped, rolling down his cheeks unchecked. For a moment, panic fluttered in his chest. This was unprecedented. Kings did not weep in public. Monarchs maintained dignity at all costs. But as he looked around at the faces surrounding him, he realized that his tears were not a sign of weakness to be hidden, but a bridge to be crossed. Lance Corporal Jackson, the massive soldier whose intimidating presence usually cleared a path wherever he walked, was sobbing openly now. His broad shoulders shook with the force of his emotion, and his hands, capable of deadly force when needed, were clasped before him like a child's. When he looked up at Charles, his eyes held a mixture of relief and gratitude that spoke of burdens shared rather than burdens carried alone. "Sir," Jackson's voice was rough with emotion. "We've all felt it. The weight. The knowing that people depend on you, that you can't fail them, that you have to be strong even when you're breaking inside. We see it in you, and it makes us feel less alone." The words hit Charles like a revelation. All his life, he had assumed that his struggles were unique, that the burden of monarchy was something he had to bear in isolation. He had never considered that others might understand, that the soldiers sworn to protect him might carry similar weights, face similar challenges, feel the same crushing responsibility for the welfare of others. Colonel Morrison, still kneeling with his hat beside him on the ancient stones, spoke with the voice of a man who had learned hard truths in dangerous places. "Your Majesty, we've served under many commanders, followed many leaders. But you're the first one who carries the same look we see in our own mirrors. The look of someone who would rather bear the pain himself than see others suffer." Charles felt his legs weakening, not from physical exhaustion, but from the overwhelming emotion of finally being understood. For 75 years, he had carried his duties with stoic determination, believing that emotional distance was necessary for effective leadership. But now, surrounded by these soldiers who had looked into the same abyss of responsibility he faced daily, he began to understand that connection, not distance, might be the key to true service. Private Davies, whose brother had died in service, looked up with eyes that held both grief and hope. "When we heard about your struggles, sir, about the times you felt you weren't ready, about how you worried you couldn't live up to your mother's example, we felt it too." Every soldier knows that feeling. Every person who serves something bigger than themselves knows that fear. The revelation that his private struggles were not private at all initially shocked Charles. But then he realized that perhaps that was the point. Perhaps leadership was not about projecting invulnerability, but about sharing the honest struggles that came with responsibility. Perhaps his perceived weaknesses were actually the very things that qualified him to lead others who faced similar challenges. Guardsman Patel, the young soldier who had lost his mother, spoke through his tears with a maturity that belied his 19 years. "You've shown us that it's possible to serve even when your heart is breaking, to carry on even when you feel lost. Your example has helped us through our darkest moments, sir. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real." Charles realized that the ceremony he had anticipated, the formal exchange of salutes and acknowledgments, had been transformed into something far more profound. This was not about military protocol or royal tradition. This was about human beings recognizing their shared struggles and finding strength in that recognition. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting longer shadows across the courtyard and warming the air that had been so crisp earlier. But the warmth Charles felt had nothing to do with the weather. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen, truly understood, truly connected to the people he served. The weight of the crown remained, but somehow it felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, but shared. These soldiers were not just protecting his physical person. They were sharing his emotional burden, carrying part of the load that had seemed so impossibly heavy when borne alone. As he stood there, tears flowing freely down his face, Charles understood that this moment would change everything. Not just for him, but for everyone present. They had crossed a threshold together, moving from the formal relationship between sovereign and subject to something more honest, more human, and ultimately more powerful than any ceremony could create. Standing there with tears flowing down his face, surrounded by kneeling soldiers who had bared their souls to him, Charles faced the most important decision of his reign. Every instinct bred into him by decades of royal training screamed for him to maintain dignity, to acknowledge their gesture formally, and return a protocol. But something deeper, more human, more true was calling him toward a different response entirely. The silence in the courtyard had become a living thing, pregnant with possibility and change. The kneeling soldiers waited, their faces upturned toward him with an expectation that went far beyond military ceremony. They had offered him their vulnerability, their truth, their shared understanding of the burden of service. Now they waited to see what he would do with that gift. Charles looked down at his own uniform, at the medals and ribbons that spoke of duty and service, at the ceremonial sword that had never drawn blood, but had symbolized his oath to protect his people. In that moment, these symbols felt both incredibly heavy and utterly inadequate to express what was happening in his heart. Without conscious thought, his hands moved to the clasps of his military jacket. The gold braiding and formal decorations that marked his rank as sovereign suddenly felt like armor he no longer needed to wear. As he slowly began to remove the jacket, a collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled soldiers. This was not protocol. This was something unprecedented, something that would be remembered and talked about for generations. The jacket slipped from his shoulders, and he folded it carefully before placing it on the stone steps behind him. Underneath, he wore a simple white shirt that made him look less like a monarch and more like the man he truly was, someone who had spent his entire life in service to others, someone who understood sacrifice and duty and the weight of carrying other people's hopes and dreams. Then, slowly, deliberately, Charles stepped forward toward the kneeling soldiers. His polished boots clicked against the ancient stones as he approached Guardsman Williams, the young man whose tears had first captured his attention. The king stopped directly in front of the soldier and, to the astonishment of everyone present, began to lower himself to one knee. The sight of their sovereign kneeling sent a shockwave through the assembled guard. This was beyond unprecedented. This was revolutionary. Kings did not kneel before their subjects. Monarchs did not humble themselves before soldiers. But Charles was no longer thinking like a king in that moment. He was responding like a human being who had been touched by the genuine emotion of others. As his knee touched the cold stone, Charles reached out and placed his hands on Williams's shoulders. The young soldier's eyes widened in shock, but there was no fear there, only wonder and a deepening of the connection that had already been forged through shared vulnerability. "No, my boy," Charles said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed courtyard. "You don't kneel before me. We kneel together. We serve together. We carry this burden together." Williams's tears came harder now, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. For 2 years since joining the Guards, he had struggled with the weight of his oath, the responsibility of protecting not just a person, but an institution that represented everything he had been taught to value. Now, seeing his king kneeling beside him as an equal, he understood that he was not alone in feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of that responsibility. Charles turned to Corporal Singh, still kneeling nearby with his head bowed. Moving carefully so as not to disturb the solemnity of the moment, Charles shifted to face the Sikh soldier directly. "Your grandfather served with honor," he said quietly, demonstrating a knowledge of his soldiers that surprised everyone present. "You carry on his tradition of service, but you also forge your own path. I see your struggle to balance your faith, your heritage, and your duty to the crown. Know that your diversity strengthens us all." Singh looked up with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed not just by the king's presence beside him, but by the clear indication that Charles knew him as an individual, understood his personal challenges, recognized his unique contributions. This was not the distant monarch of popular imagination. This was a leader who paid attention to the people under his command. Moving through the ranks, Charles knelt beside each soldier in turn. To Sergeant MacDonald, he spoke of the challenges facing women in military service and thanked her for breaking barriers that had made it easier for others to follow. To Lance Corporal Jackson, he acknowledged the particular burden carried by those whose physical presence made them natural protectors, and the emotional cost of always being expected to be strong. When he reached Private Davies, the soldier whose brother had died in action, Charles paused for a long moment before speaking. "I cannot replace what you have lost," he said simply, "but I can promise you that his sacrifice was not in vain, and that his memory lives on in the service you continue to give. Grief and duty can coexist, sometimes they must." Davies sobbed openly at these words, her carefully maintained military composure completely abandoned. But there was healing in her tears, a sense that her loss had been acknowledged and honored by the highest authority in the land. Her brother's death had not been just another casualty in a distant conflict. It had been a personal sacrifice recognized by the very person he had died serving. To young Guardsman Patel, still mourning his mother's recent death, Charles offered words that came from his own experience of loss. "The pain of losing a parent never fully goes away," he said gently. "But it transforms into something else, a deeper understanding of life's preciousness, a stronger commitment to honoring their memory through our actions. Your mother's love lives on in the service you give and the man you are becoming." The personal nature of Charles's knowledge about each soldier became increasingly clear as he moved through the ranks. This was not information from briefing files or casual observations. This was the result of genuine attention, of a leader who had taken the time to know the people who served under him. It spoke to a depth of caring that went far beyond royal duty. When Charles finally reached Colonel Morrison, the veteran officer was struggling to maintain his composure. As his sovereign knelt beside him, Morrison's professional facade completely cracked. Here was a man who had led soldiers through combat, who had made life and death decisions under fire, who had earned respect through competence and courage. Yet in this moment, he was simply a human being overwhelmed by unexpected compassion from his ultimate commander. "Sir," Morrison managed to say through his tears, "we are honored to serve under you, not because of your title, but because of who you are as a man." Charles felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him again. "The honor is mine, Colonel," he replied. "You and your soldiers have taught me more about leadership in these few minutes than I learned in decades of formal training. You have shown me that true authority comes not from position, but from connection, not from distance, but from understanding." As Charles knelt there among his soldiers, all of them on the same level, all of them sharing the same vulnerability, a transformation was taking place that would ripple far beyond the palace walls. Word of this unprecedented moment would spread throughout the military, throughout the Commonwealth, throughout the world. Stories would be told of the king who knelt beside his soldiers, who shared their tears, who proved that true leadership required not elevation above others, but connection with them. The morning sun continued its climb across the sky, but time seemed suspended in the palace courtyard. Palace staff who had gathered to witness what they thought would be a routine ceremony found themselves crying as well, moved by the raw humanity of what they were witnessing. This was not the distant monarchy of tradition. This was leadership transformed by love, authority tempered by empathy, power made meaningful through service. When Charles finally rose from his kneeling position, he did not immediately step back or resume his formal posture. Instead, he remained among the soldiers, still close enough to touch, still connected to them in a way that transcended rank and title. The message was clear. This moment of connection was not temporary, not a brief deviation from normal protocol. This was a new normal, a fundamental shift in how he would relate to those who served under him. The soldiers slowly rose as well, but they remained close to their king, forming a circle around him that spoke of protection, but also of inclusion. They were no longer just his guards. They were his partners in service, his companions in carrying the weight of duty that none of them could bear alone. As Charles reached for his jacket, preparing to dress again in the symbols of his office, he knew that everything had changed. The uniform would look the same, the ceremonies would follow similar patterns, but the relationship between sovereign and subject had been forever altered by this moment of shared humanity. 3 months after that transformative morning in the palace courtyard, the effects of what the press had dubbed the kneeling king moment continued to reverberate far beyond the walls of Buckingham Palace. What had begun as an unexpected break from protocol during a routine inspection had become a defining moment of Charles's reign, reshaping not only how the monarchy connected with its people, but how leadership itself was understood across the Commonwealth and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of that emotional ceremony, Charles had made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than treating the moment as an aberration to be managed and contained, he chose to embrace it as a new way of engaging with his role as sovereign. The formal barriers that had traditionally separated the monarchy from the people it served began to come down, replaced by something more honest, more human, and ultimately more powerful. The changes started small, but grew quickly. Charles's next public engagement, a visit to a veterans' hospital in London, was unlike any royal visit in recent memory. Instead of the usual receiving line and formal presentations, he spent hours sitting beside hospital beds, listening to stories, sharing memories, and offering comfort to men and women who had given their health and service to their country. The image of the king holding the hand of a dying veteran, tears in both their eyes, became one of the most widely shared photographs of the decade. At that hospital, Charles met former Sergeant Major William Thompson, a man who had lost both legs in an improvised explosive device attack in Afghanistan. Thompson had been struggling with depression and a sense of purposelessness since his injury, feeling forgotten by the very institution he had nearly died serving. But when Charles knelt beside his wheelchair and spent 45 minutes simply listening to his story, something fundamental shifted for both men. "Your Majesty," Thompson had said that day, his voice shaking with emotion, "I thought my service was over, that I didn't matter anymore. But seeing you here, really seeing me, not just going through the motions, it makes me feel like maybe I still have value." Charles had gripped the veteran's hand tightly, his own voice thick with feeling as he replied, "Your service will never be over, William. Your sacrifice will never be forgotten. And your value as a human being, as a brother in arms, could never be diminished by any injury or setback. You have given everything to protect others. Now let others help protect and support you." The interaction had been captured by news cameras, and the footage spread around the world within hours. But more importantly, it had sparked a movement. Other veterans, inspired by Thompson's courage in sharing his struggles, began reaching out to the palace, to each other, to their communities. Support networks that had been fragmented and underfunded suddenly found themselves with royal backing and public attention. Charles's willingness to show his own vulnerability had given others permission to acknowledge theirs. Back at the palace, the transformation continued. The members of the royal guard who had participated in that emotional morning found their duties expanded beyond traditional ceremonial functions. Charles began meeting with small groups of them regularly, not for formal briefings, but for conversations about their experiences, their challenges, their insights into leadership and service. These sessions, dubbed roundtable talks by the participants, became a crucial part of how decisions were made about military welfare and support programs. Guardsman Williams, the young soldier whose tears had first moved Charles to respond with such unprecedented emotion, found his life changed in ways he could never have imagined. The king had remembered his story, his background, his dreams of eventually becoming a teacher when his military service ended. Within weeks of that transformative morning, Williams received information about education programs specifically designed for serving soldiers, scholarship opportunities he had never known existed, and mentorship from former military personnel who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. "I never expected the king to remember my name, let alone my dreams," Williams confided to his mother during a phone call home to Wales. "But he sent me a personal note about the teaching program, said he thought I had the heart of an educator as well as a soldier. It changed everything, not just my prospects, but how I see myself." The ripple effects extended beyond individual lives to institutional changes throughout the military and civil service. Charles's demonstration that vulnerability could coexist with authority, that empathy could strengthen rather than weaken leadership, inspired commanders at all levels to reconsider their approach to personnel management. Mental health support, previously stigmatized and underfunded, became a priority. Programs for family support, career transition, and personal development expanded dramatically. Colonel Morrison, whose own emotional response that morning had initially embarrassed him professionally, found that his willingness to show genuine feeling had actually enhanced his effectiveness as a leader. Soldiers under his command began approaching him with problems they had previously hidden, trusting that their vulnerability would be met with understanding rather than judgment. The result was a more cohesive, more honest, and ultimately more effective military unit. That morning changed how I understood command, Morrison reflected during an interview with a military journal 6 months later. "I had always thought leadership meant having all the answers, projecting strength at all costs. But His Majesty showed us that real strength comes from connection, from shared purpose, from being willing to admit that we're all struggling with something." The transformation wasn't limited to the military. Word of the king's unprecedented emotional openness spread throughout the Commonwealth, inspiring similar changes in how leaders engaged with those they served. The Prime Minister of Canada began holding regular listening sessions with citizens from all walks of life. The Governor-General of Australia established new programs for connecting with Indigenous communities based on principles of mutual respect and shared vulnerability. Even corporate leaders began adopting what business schools started calling the Charles model: leadership through authentic connection rather than hierarchical distance. International reaction was initially mixed. Some traditional monarchists worried that Charles was diminishing the mystique and authority of the crown. European royal families watched nervously, uncertain whether this new approach would enhance or undermine the institution of monarchy more broadly. Republican movements in several Commonwealth nations initially celebrated what they saw as the monarchy's admission of weakness. But public opinion polls told a different story. Support for the monarchy reached levels not seen since the early years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. More importantly, the nature of that support had changed. Previous royal popularity had often been based on admiration from a distance, respect for an institution that seemed above the concerns of ordinary people. Now, support came from identification, from a sense that the monarchy truly understood and cared about the struggles of regular citizens. The change was perhaps most visible in how Charles approached his regular public engagements. State dinners became conversations rather than ceremonies. Factory visits turned into listening sessions where workers felt comfortable sharing their real concerns about economic pressures and job security. School visits evolved from formal presentations to genuine discussions about education, opportunity, and the challenges facing young people in an uncertain world. During one particularly memorable visit to a struggling comprehensive school in Birmingham, Charles spent the entire afternoon not with administrators and carefully selected high-achieving students, but in the cafeteria, in detention rooms, and in the counseling office, talking with students who were facing real challenges. When 16-year-old Amara Jackson, whose family had been threatened with eviction, broke down while describing her fears about her future, Charles didn't offer platitudes about perseverance. Instead, he shared his own struggles with feeling unprepared for the responsibilities thrust upon him, his own fears about failing those who depended on him. "I used to think the crown made me special," he told Amara, and the other students gathered around them. "But what I've learned is that it just makes me responsible. Responsible for listening, for caring, for doing whatever I can to make sure young people like you have the chances you deserve. Your struggles matter. Your dreams matter. And you're not facing them alone." The conversation was recorded by a student on her phone and went viral on social media within hours. But more importantly, it sparked a nationwide conversation about educational funding, social support, and the responsibility of leadership at all levels. Within 6 months, new programs for at-risk students were implemented across the country, many of them personally championed by Charles and funded through royal charitable foundations. As autumn returned to London, exactly 1 year after that transformative morning in the palace courtyard, Charles stood once again before the assembled royal guard for their annual formal inspection. But this time, everything was different. The soldiers stood at attention with the same professional discipline as always, but their eyes held warmth and familiarity rather than distant respect. When Colonel Morrison called for the salute, the response was crisp and perfect, but it was followed by something unprecedented in royal ceremony. After completing the formal protocol, the soldiers remained at attention for a moment longer. Then, simultaneously, without command or signal, they each took a single step forward. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible to outside observers, but its meaning was profound. They were closing the distance, bridging the gap, demonstrating that the connection forged in vulnerability a year earlier had become a permanent part of their service. Charles understood immediately. His own step forward in response was automatic, natural, right? King and guard stood closer than protocol dictated, connected by something stronger than tradition or duty. They stood as partners in service, united by shared purpose and mutual respect, no longer separated by the artificial distances that had once defined royal relationships. As he looked into their faces, faces he now knew as individuals, stories he had heard, struggles he had witnessed, Charles realized that the unexpected response from his royal guard that morning a year ago had accomplished something he never could have planned or mandated. It had transformed not just his own understanding of leadership, but the very nature of the institution he represented. The monarchy would never be the same. But then again, neither would any of them. They had discovered that true authority came not from elevation above others, but from connection with them. They had learned that real strength lay not in the projection of invulnerability, but in the shared acknowledgement of struggle. Most importantly, they had proven that even the most ancient and formal institutions could be renewed through the simple, revolutionary act of genuine human caring. The autumn sun set over London that evening with a warmth that had nothing to do with weather, illuminating a palace, a monarchy, and a kingdom forever changed by the power of tears shared, burdens lifted together, and hearts open in service to something greater than any single person could carry alone.